We've been asked to report on a study that was done on young single adults. The priesthood department commissioned a group to get some figures and facts for us on this very important subject. And so, under the direction of C. Heathen, they've done their work and they're ready to share those results with us if you can. Bruce. We'll introduce Alan and Dale. Grateful to have President Beck here too. Thank you.
Not easy to regain your composure after that. But it occurs to me that those soldiers are in the age group we're going to be talking about for the most part. On Sunday, I heard a fine returned missionary give a stirring report on his mission in my own ward for sacrament meeting. And afterward, I went up and talked to him about what he was going to do now to keep that fire alive and to serve with all the capacity he had developed. Those returned missionaries are at the heart, the spiritual heart of the group we're talking about. They are really the future of the church. And so to have our feelings stirred in that way is not inappropriate. We don't want to lose anybody in this group either. I'm happy to welcome Alan Wilkins. Many of you would know Alan. He just returned from presiding over a mission in Argentina. Has worked at BYU for some years. Was earlier president of a student stake at BYU. Elder Dale Rimland is in Area 70 who lives here in Salt Lake City and has had some responsibility for young single adults in Utah and particularly Salt Lake, and was involved in some very fine work a few years ago that led to a first presidency letter we'll be referring to. The work we report to you today builds on that letter. The other members of the task committee who've been working for about a year include members of the General Relief Society presidency. We welcome Sister Beck here. She has a great interest in this subject. We've also had representatives of the Young Women's Presidency, the Young Men's General Board, Brother Perry Cunningham from Research Information, who made a presentation on this age group to this committee a few weeks ago. And as I recall, President Packer, you asked him, so what does this mean for us? And really that's where we'll pick up today, focusing on what it does mean for us. I mentioned that letter. I'll talk in just a second about a couple of key points made in that letter. And note that this letter about young single adults and increasing their accountability and the accountability of stake presidents for them was sent only to leaders in North America. And so it was intended we would see what came of that and see where we go next. So this interim report also provides you with some context for some proposals that will come forward for revised handbook 2. We've identified 2 or 3 issues, reviewed them with the handbook committee, and we're glad for this opportunity for you to see the background from which those specific proposals will come. And you'll note 2 or 3 in what follows that will need that kind of review. In general, the committee has felt, as so many of us, all know from personal experience, young single adults are among the church's most underutilized resources. They have enormous potential, but face high risks in today's world. I'll first invite Alan Wilkins to report on the main findings of the committee, and then I'll introduce Elder Renland, who will report on the main recommendations.
As Perry Cunningham presented to you, this is an age group, the 20s, the young single adults, when where people are most likely to be inactive in churches. This is true across North America, but it is also true in the church, and we want to talk about some of the reasons for that. Young single adults we're talking about now in the church, take longer to finish education, marry, and begin a career than they did 2 decades ago. There seems to be a need for more education for many of the jobs that are now in our economy, in North America particularly. And there seemed to be a decrease in norms that favor marriage. Now the social norms more often allow and favor experimenting, trying things out, cohabitation as they call it, and not having as many children. And so the average age for members of the church who marry outside of the temple is 27 for marriage for men and 25 for women. When they marry in the temple, it's 24 for men and 23 for women. Those are numbers that have averages that have been increasing over the last couple of decades. And so they cause significant concern. The principal concern is that delaying marriage in an era of high immorality, more increasing access to pornography, constitutes significant, very high risks for our young single adults. What we've noticed is that church activity begins to decline in the teenage years and continues to decline into the 20s. The current activity rate for young single adults in North America is 30%, 20% internationally. It's about 25% worldwide. What's interesting about that to us is that married adults, young adults, people of the same age who get married are twice as active as single. So there's something about being single. This is something that Robert Wuthnow, a sociologist at Princeton, whose work Perry Cunningham used significantly in his report to you, found across religions, that is in North America at least, where they have very good data, what they're finding both in surveys as well as in interview studies is that young people who are not married don't feel as welcome. They don't feel that they're needed. They aren't given positions and opportunities to serve as much, and they don't feel that their interests and needs are being addressed. And so this is true across religions, but even more so in other religions, frankly, than in our church. As we look internationally, 6% of international members are temple married by age 30, and that's been declining over the last couple of decades. The implication of that is for us is significant. It's beyond what's happening to young single adults and becomes an issue about the establishment of the church as a multi-generational institution. The elements that would be required to have a multi-generational church include, first, retaining our young people through their youth and young single adulthood, having them marry in the temple, and then having them have children. Each of those three areas shows declining rates in the last couple of decades. We're having declining activity, we're having declining marriages in the temple, and the fertility rates are decreasing. And so the question then of how we establish the international church given what's happening to young single adults is a significant one. It's difficult, as you all know, to find a companion. Internationally particularly, about 70 active men per 100 active women across many of these countries. And beyond that, many of the women are more educated than the men. Sister Allred of the Relief Society Presidency came back from Central America. She just met with a large group of of women in this age group, principals of high schools, doctors, lawyers, significant education. They couldn't find somebody in the church their equal, and in many cases the norms, men aren't willing to have the woman put them through school, as might be the case in North America. So significant problems in bringing them together that we want to talk about, at least try to address. We've also discovered that most young single adults are not in young single adult or student wards where they might find, where they might be gathered together and might have more likelihood of finding a companion. They're often as well invisible to their ward leaders. 20% of the records of young single adults worldwide are here in church headquarters. We don't know where they belong. another 20 to 30% in samplings of bishops as they've been asked to identify who are these people who are on your records, these young single adults. 20 to 30% of them they don't know. Another 20 to 30% are less active. They know them, but they're not involved and not active. One of the problems is that our current reporting system does not let local leaders track young single adult activity at the group or individual level. As you know, once they leave youth programs, we don't keep roll, and so we don't have individual attendance data. Hard for a state president to say this ward's having some difficulty and this one isn't as much in terms of activity. And hard for a bishop to track individual early warning signs as they're not involved. But even more significant, those who are active are typically not involved in serving in positions of responsibility. Both Elder Clayton Christensen and Sister Beck have talked about experiences in Korea. I'll just share in the interest of time. Sister Beck came back from a visit to Korea and had noticed that youth and young single adults were not particularly involved in callings, and had asked them about that. And as I remember, Sister Beck, they were saying, well, they're too busy preparing for national exams and in their schooling. Well, how did you run the church? How did you lead the church when you were young? And most of them were the high school and college age people who led the church in those days. Well, we just had to sacrifice. They had to do both. That's part of the problem. They're not trusting, not giving the challenge to these young single adults. Elder Whitney Clayton, who's not with us today, but was my area president when I was in Argentina, was the first one to teach me the STP principle. The same 10 people tend to rotate through the significant responsibilities in a ward, and that was certainly true in Latin America, and he was saying in other parts of the world. We've been seeing that with respect to young single adults. They're not being challenged and given opportunities. Beyond that, we think this isn't just about having callings as a district president or an elders quorum president. It's being significantly involved in the key work of the kingdom. That's the part that we're hearing from young single adults, that they're feeling they're not as involved. And since most of them are in conventional wards, how does that happen? Well, there are some lessons we could learn for the conventional wards that we could learn from some of the strongest young single adult and student wards. Those groups tend to do two things. They gather people, and that doesn't have to be the size of a ward. They gather them in smaller groups, and they engage them in meaningful service together. What we're seeing in a number of cases is they will, in some young single adult wards, create a second relief society, create a second elders quorum, both to provide more opportunity to serve, but also to reach the individuals, to activate, to reactivate them. But we've also been seeing in a number of young single adult and student wards the formation of committees. For example, these are digital world-friendly youth who can do wonderful things with the computer in identifying, in doing family history work, for example, and also in teaching others in the ward how to do that. There are committees that have been formed to do reactivation, to reach out, and a number of other experiences where they feel like they're involved in the core work of the church. What we're noticing is, and this is anecdotal now, we don't have great data, but we have at BYU, for example, and some of you have been at BYU to know that we have lots of superlatives there, and sometimes people exaggerate a bit, so take this with a grain of salt. But one stake president said, after having significantly worked on establishing these kinds of committees, he said, we had 3 times the temple marriages of any other stake at BYU. It was not the parties, it was getting them involved in doing this work together that made the difference. They lost themselves and forgot themselves. They weren't in a meat market. They were doing the core work of the church and now getting to know one another. And he thought that made a significant difference. We're not sure about 3 times, but it seems to make quite a difference to be able to do this kind of thing. So, in summary, our key findings are that we're losing an increasing number of our young single adults. This poses a threat not only to this age group, but to the growth of a multi-generational church. And paradoxically, we're losing them because we aren't using them in meaningful ways.
Thank you, Alan. Brethren, as a As a foundation for the recommendations that will follow from Elder Renlund, I'd like to refer to the First Presidency letter sent in October of 2006. This phrase comes from that letter. The letter assigned young single adult accountability to stake presidents, asking each stake in North America to be accountable for all young single adults residing in their stake, to identify, locate, and shepherd each one, and to support multi-stake activities. Those were the essential components of that letter. The letter was the result of a great deal of preparation, and it has led to a great deal of action through the priesthood lines in North America. And as this committee has worked and looked deeper and longer since that time, they've concluded this was exactly the place to start. And so what you hear in the findings will be based on that foundation. The advantages of locating responsibility for young single adults at the stake level are such as these. Stake presidents have the keys and the authority to hold the ward young single adult committees accountable. Those committees have been in the handbook for years. They typically don't function. A member of the Relief Society presidency, a member of the Elders presidency, chaired by a member of the bishopric. Not much happens, but more could happen if they were held accountable by those who have the vision. Another factor that's very important is that at the stake level, which I've seen, especially in my international experience, the institutes of religion typically function at the stake level. And so if you want to have a stronger partnership, stronger coordination with the institutes under priesthood direction, you achieve that at the stake level as well. And multi-stake interaction, of course, will be better facilitated when that takes place at the stake level. The stake president can also organize a stronger structure than we have been seeing, and we'll have just a couple of ideas to share on that toward the end. As we introduce the recommendations, I just wanted to say something to put the focus on our two main points. One, stake level responsibility, and number two, emphasize spiritual development. Too often we have thought of social development as the main need of young single adults. We all want them to get married, and you assume that you get married if you go do social things. This committee, based on its research, has reached quite a different conclusion, as Alan has already indicated. They found that when young single adults are engaged in spiritually oriented service, that blesses them, not only spiritually, but with greater opportunities for marriage. And so, coming from this foundation, one of the recommendations will be to call more of them to positions of responsibility. I heard Elder Holland say this morning in a meeting of MEC and PEC, talking about a young woman of 29 called to be what?
Primary president.
How did she feel?
She said it was her lifeline that saved her. She thought she was of no use to anyone because no one was marrying her. But she has really blossomed as the primary president.
And yet we tend to overlook them. So we would hope to shift the orientation of all young single adults, including those in young single adult and student wards, to a spiritual service focus that includes sociality. Of course it's important, but it's secondary, it's not primary. Just to give two quick examples before I sit down, I shared these with the brethren and thought who were working with us. Just last week, you might remember Elder Ballard read to a number of us an email he'd received from a young single adult who had worked on Proposition 8 in California. And I really was struck by what she said. One thing was, because of her service in this cause, she learned the meaning of marriage. Now she understood what the church had been teaching because she'd been involved. It's like a missionary saying, now I understand the gospel because I've been preaching it. And she was thankful for the opportunity to be involved. You could just sense what it had meant to have that kind of cause in which she could work in the service of the Lord's servants. Another example of that, on the other end of the continent, I was at a stake president a few months ago in a stake conference. They had hundreds of young single adults in this stake, wonderfully educated young men and women who are in Washington, D.C., working in congressional offices and other places. Stake president said one of the great discoveries he'd made in that stake was how those young single adults could help the inner city ward he has in that stake. They've baptized a number of young people from minority backgrounds who live in poverty, who aren't very literate. And he brought his young single adults together with those young people from that inner city stake every Wednesday night. And on a one-on-one basis, the young single adults would tutor them and help them do their high school homework and convey a vision about education, about the future. That can happen only in that relationship. And he cited 2 or 3 examples of those who had succeeded, the graduates of books and basketball, who went on, a couple of them, to BYU, and they're carrying that on. So after they've studied, they'll play a little basketball, read the scriptures, and have refreshments. And that's very much the flavor of the kind of service that can involve young single adults serving youth and building themselves spiritually. I invite Elder Renlund to continue with the recommendations.
As Elder Hafen mentioned, the new priesthood department recommendations extend beyond the accountability aspect of the First Presidency letter of October 2006 to go on to encourage stake presidents to use all active young single adults, including those in young single adult wards, to help convert, retain, and activate youth and other young single adults in the stake. This is a plea to deploy young single adults to participate in the gathering of scattered Israel and to use them in the cause of Zion. In the Winter 14th Ward in this valley, a young single adult ward, the young single adults there have gone out and literally tracted out the less active young single adults in their stake and in the neighboring Salt Lake Mill Creek stake. They have helped update membership records. They have reactivated some, and they themselves have experienced a greater commitment and an increase in faith because they have been involved in that effort. If it helps with either the accountability aspect or the mobilizing aspect of it, stake presidents could create more than one relief society or elders quorum in a ward when justified by local conditions and numbers. This would be an option to use if it helps the stake president achieve better accountability or mobilize them better. This could be done. Stake presidents, and this has been done to good effect in several wards throughout this state and elsewhere. Stake presidents would also be encouraged to mobilize young single adult task groups for various forms of church service. Elder Hafen mentioned the Proposition 8 experience, the Books and Basketball initiative that was in Washington, D.C. Books and Basketball occurred in Palo Alto, California, and in Cambridge, Massachusetts as well. In fact, there's no challenge the church faces or any aspect of the mission of the church to which the strength, energy, and vitality of the young single adults cannot be applied. In addition, the recommendations would extend the 2006 First Presidency letter to all international areas, both in the accountability part and in the second paragraph of that letter, which was the grouping of beyond the stake or the district to increase the numbers for activities. This has been done elsewhere throughout the world already. Elder Christofferson told us at General Conference about the young single adults from Moldova who went to Hungary for a young single adult conference. The 6 stakes in and around Sydney, Australia have sponsored jointly a fireside each month for the young single adults in their 6 stakes. And similar things have happened in Europe and in Asia. The recommendations would modify the current reporting system to enable reporting of young single adult activity. As Brother Wilkins mentioned, young single adults are often invisible to their priesthood leaders. As the pilot programs in late 2005 that Elder Oakes and Elder Bednar directed, many conventional ward bishops were surprised and shocked that they had underestimated the number of young single adults who had membership records in their wards by 5 to 10-fold. They were just shocked that they had that many. And they're invisible. President Monson has said, of course, when performance is measured, performance improves. Hence, this recommended modification. There's a way to accomplish this without increasing the work of the bishop and without creating a new report, rather modifying the current report using data that are already being collected. Ministering to young single adults is complex, and perhaps unnecessarily so. We make distinctions among them when the priesthood needs are in fact the same. For instance, in Midvale, Utah, we have a stake, a conventional stake, where the stake president holds priesthood keys for that geography. We also have the Salt Lake University 7th stake, a single student stake, where the stake president holds priesthood keys for the very same geography. Additionally, we have yet another Salt Lake University single student stake, the Salt Lake University 6th stake, that presides over LDS Business College and Westminster College, that also, that stake president has keys for that self-same territory. This overlapping jurisdiction creates ambiguity and accountability, increases choices for young single adults, which leads to ward shopping and generates conflict among priesthood leaders. One could say, well, the student stake presidents have priesthood keys for students. But in practice, that distinction is actually blurred. And the reason it's blurred, well, the data are that in the Salt Lake University single student stakes, less than 30% of the members are in fact students. And even at BYU, once we get off campus, the non-student membership goes between about 25 and 50% of those student stakes. It's also problematic to define a student. If I am a young single adult and I'm a matriculated college student this semester, but not next, do we really want me to have two stake presidents, one each semester? If I'm a matriculated student, my roommate isn't, should we really have two different stake presidents? And should the student refer just to college-enrolled students, or does it refer to any form of post-high school education, such as massage therapy or cosmetology? To reduce the complexity, increase accountability, and unify priesthood leaders in ministering to young single adults, the recommendations would eliminate the overlapping jurisdictional conflict that occurs when multiple sets of equivalent keys are operative for the same geographic territory. The recommendations would eliminate the distinction between student wards and young single adult wards. This elimination makes sense because the priesthood needs are the same for a young single adult who's a student as well as one who's not a student. Moreover, the simplification and increased accountability occur because one would never have two young single adult wards operative in the same geographical territory. The recommendations would further encourage all young single adults to attend institute classes and activities. The stake structure would be strengthened by creating a stake committee specifically for young single adults. This would be chaired, right now we have a stake committee for single members that includes all singles. This would be one specific to young single adults. It would be chaired by a stake president's counselor. It would have a high counselor assigned to it. It would also include a Stake Relief Society presidency member, a married couple who would serve as advisors, and young single adults called from the units of that stake. The ward could also have a stronger structure for an award young single adult committee. There would be a bishopric member who would serve as chairman, a Relief Society and Elders Quorum presidency member, a married couple who serve as advisors, some young single adults would also serve on that committee. Each young single adult in the ward would be accounted for regularly by the ward committee, the ward young single adult committee, to the ward council. Each young single adult would be interviewed annually by a bishopric member, preferably the one who serves as the chair of that young single adult committee at the ward level. Each young single adult would be visited by Elders Quorum and Relief Society presidency members annually, preferably the same ones who serve on the young single adult committee. And each young single adult would be accounted for regularly by the bishop to the stake president. We heard about the final salute and that we should bring them home. And I think that's what this effort is about. Elder Hafen?
Thank you, Elder Renlund. Brethren, this concludes our presentation. Our summary is that the best way to strengthen young single adults is to engage them in the mainstream work of the church. Second, their greater spiritual engagement will bless the entire church because it will increase the number of young people who are married in the temple, and raising families in the pattern of establishing the church long term. Unless we do that, anything we do programmatically makes relatively little difference. So there's much at stake in how we respond. And the best organizational step, the committee has recommended, and we endorse the executive directors in the priesthood department, to clarify and emphasize the stakes, responsibility, and flexibility to serve the needs of these young people in the ways that we have discussed. We'd invite comments and questions. We're very eager to take your counsel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brethren, any questions?
Elder Renlund, the modification of the reporting system to better identify young single adults and account for them. Are you speaking of the quarterly report that each ward and stake do, or others?
I will give my understanding, and then I'll ask Elder Hafen to correct me. Currently, the quarterly report, the ward clerk has noted what proportion attend meetings during the quarter.
Total population of the
Total
ward.
Adults. Okay, within the adults.
Population.
One could, I believe, easily make it so that one just separates out the young single adults from the non-young single adults, from the total adults, and report that without, again, increasing work for the bishop or creating a new report.
We've already talked to Glenn Buckner in MSR, who's been working on this for some time to help us see if it's possible, and he recommends that you would need to have the clerk once a quarter print out the list of young single adult names and then indicate have they attended a meeting within the last month of the quarter, and he would know that or could learn it from ward council members, and then he can send in the numbers of young adults attending, young single adults. So it would be you'd split the adult line into two parts, young single adults and other adults.
Now that would be the state quarterly report.
Right.
But the ward, you also need ward data, right?
Well, it would come from the ward to the stake.
So the ward would have its own
Yeah.
report as well.
But we wouldn't
The system
collect
is already set up to print out young single adults,
Yes.
doesn't it?
Yes, Glenn, if they know the ages,
Already
they can print
identified.
out that list right at the ward level.
Another question for Brother Renlund. Could you elaborate just a little bit on the mechanics and the implications of combining the young single adult wards and the student wards? I'm a little hazy on that, and if you could elaborate examples, or in the Salt Lake Valley, that's the hardest place to conceptualize that.
I believe that if one thinks of the parameter to look at as the density in the population of young single adults, one would have circumstances where it's exclusively young single adults, such as BYU on-campus housing. It's exclusively young single adult. That's easy because it will function like our current young single adult or our current student stakes do now. There are areas where the young single adult population density isn't moderate or high, away from campus, where it really is they're just it's the responsibility is given to the conventional stake president. The tools he has available are several, and however best he can increase accountability and mobilize them, could create then a stake-based young single adult ward if he chose to do that as the best way to accomplish what we've asked him. The difficult place is, of course, where it's moderate to high density, population density. Let's say the Salt Lake Central stake. In the Salt Lake Central stake, President Adams may look, for instance, and say, I've got 1,100 active YSAs that live within the bounds of my stake. I do not have the priesthood capacity to call 6 bishoprics from the members of my stake. Therefore, I will make it so it's as a YSA stake even, but it's including not just the students and not just the active, but it's there for all young single adults. And it overlays precisely, for instance, the Salt Lake Central stake. To some extent, that conventional stake president defers or bestows the responsibility for the young single adults to that other stake president.
It would bring back students now in University of Utah stakes to the
conventional stake.
To the conventional stake.
Yes.
But it wouldn't do away with student stakes for student housing areas where the density is large.
Correct.
Thank you. That helps me understand that.
Keith?
Question.
I wonder, and this is something that's been on my mind for a good long time. I hope I'm not speaking out of school. But I wonder if the trend that we see emerging at the young single adult age doesn't start much, much earlier. And we must do what's been recommended, I believe, in terms of an interdiction that starts bringing them back. But if we watch the pattern among the Aaronic priesthood, that pattern of loss simply carries through into the young single adult effort. And I'm curious as to whether or not we couldn't go back further and start addressing the needs of young single adults in terms of their service in the church instead of being entertained in the church, in terms of significant callings in Aaronic priesthood with responsibility that goes with it, rather, not to the exclusion of activities, but something really substantive, and start to develop a new trend, a trend that says to a very young man, this is precious. And when I'm a young single adult, that pattern has already been established. Somehow arrest the trend earlier in its cycle. And I really do believe, brethren, that the opportunity for young people young men, for example, who bear the Aaronic priesthood in terms of substantive service and contribution to the kingdom is far more than we are tapping. And the pattern they become used to is simply a pattern that then continues, an expectation that continues into their young single adult lives. They're used to being entertained. They're used to being given things. They're used to standing on the sidelines while others do things. And when they're young single adults, that's where they end up. So that's just an observation, and
I'd like to make an observation, and I hope you'll take it very seriously. The one word that's been missing in all of this is family. It hasn't been said once. And I wish you'd go back and analyze everything you've done and intrude the family into the middle of it and see what's happening there. The original jurisdiction until they're married is in the parental home of the family. And we spend a lot of time on what they do as compared to trying to figure out what they are. And if you do some real skull practice on that, on what they are as compared to what they do, and also where does the family fit into all of this? This activity we're having running all directions, and where's Dad and Mom? I remember years ago, Ernest Wilkinson was proselyting for BYU. They were building BYU, and he was very vigorous and had the support of the brethren, and it was a great move in the church, and one of, I guess it might have been your mother, that President Lee, they said, well, your daughter is going to the University of Utah, missing the atmosphere of BYU, and he said something very profound. He said, well, I think the University of Utah and her mother is more important to my daughter than BYU without her. Think about it. Was that your mother?
It would have been Aunt Helen.
Aunt Helen, yes.
Others
Well,
know?
Don't ignore what I said.
In regard to what President Packer said, you talked about return missionaries as sort of being the core of young single adults. But at age 18, when young men leave high school, it's almost like they fall off a cliff. They're not on a mission yet. Some of them go to school and they're in a good student ward, but a lot don't. They just work for a year. And there's a huge loss in activity just during that 1 year. If they don't go on a mission, they kind of disappear. So I think we need to start, it kind of gets back to what Bishop McMullen said, we need to start right when they turn 18 or even younger, looking at what happens to them, not just when they're home from the mission.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's worse with the young women.
And young women,
it's worse.
There's no mission. Right.
And that's one of the reasons we're glad to have Sister Beck here. We've been talking very actively about the transition issue. You're all aware of that. But that starts immediately upon graduation. And part of the challenge is that the church is so structured with the young men and young women program, with personal progress and annual interviews with priesthood leaders, and they walk right up to age 18 and go off the edge without the structure and support. So that's part of what we're recommending. And the intent, of course, President, is to involve families as long as those young people are at home, and even when they aren't at home. That's the whole purpose of what we're seeking to do here, is to strengthen
Study
family.
carefully what we do.
Yeah.
Bishop Burton just passed me a statistic that 72% of young adults are already inactive before age 20, which means it's happened in the Aaronic priesthood year. And my thought, President, as you were saying, is the best thing we can do for youth is to make their parents better parents.
We do have to keep in mind that internationally, a lot of them are converts.
Yeah, the parents are.
And their parents, either they're totally out of touch with their parents, or their parents don't support them in the church. Not so much here, but internationally.
That's true even outside this area.
And somewhat outside Utah.
But one of the good things in international areas is that many of them come to the church without parents, but they find grandma, grandpa, father and mother in the church. Someone adopted them.
Mentor.
A lot of, and they some years ago the church took a great decision to establish institutes in Brazil and other places in South and Latin America. It was a great decision because they have a house, they have a home, and they have people taking care of them. That's one of the hard things for the after mission age, is that during the mission they receive at least 8 personal interviews a year from the mission president. When they come back home, they are not interviewed by the Elders Quorum Presidency. That's one of the great challenges, in my opinion.
Elder Perry, one of the great blessings of your service in Europe was to clarify for everybody, there's just one church. There isn't a CES church, there isn't a missionary church, and bringing that group together with the institutes as a kind of magnet for the young single adults. I can see Elder Costa nodding. That must be the pattern elsewhere too. That's another step we need to take, isn't it?
And then, of course, the importance of an adult couple being available to them. is the next most important thing. Now, I get all the credit for what happened in Europe. This is the genius behind what occurred over there. I just walked through it. My rip-raw and ha-rah and all the stuff got it worked up, and that's all the contribution I made. He's the architect of what happened over there.
Elder Snow has raised his hand.
You reported the data that our young people are marrying both in and out of activity in the church. They're married at a later date. We noted, in my time in the priesthood department, we had a lot of letters from young women who were kind of devastated by the fact that when they turned 30, they were no longer welcomed at young single adult activities. Has there been any discussion at all about extending that date or that young single adult age a little older, or softening that age 30? I'm just questioning.
Alan, you want to comment?
Quite a lot of discussion about that. They're meeting and marrying later. Shouldn't we extend the age later? Our sense is that this ought to be a temporary period in their lives, if indeed they are in a young single adult or student ward. It ought to be a focus on getting leadership experience, etc., but that we ought to rely on strengthening this conventional wards much more significantly. It felt like being banished to go to a conventional ward, strengthening the family and strengthening the conventional ward and providing for them opportunities at multi-stake and other gatherings to have service opportunities has felt like a better way to address it than to continue to lengthen out. As a matter of fact, that seems to approve of the notion that they keep putting it off. It's time to do it now and then to move on. And basically, as we talked, Elder Clayton Christensen has been doing some of this in the Northeast, working with stake presidents, so that rather than having people be pushed out of young single adult wards or student wards, they'd be pulled into the conventional ward, so that the two bishops would work together and say, this person's about to turn 31. Could you meet that person in the conventional ward, and could there be a calling to invite them back? And that felt like a better way to do it.
Pull instead of push.
Pull instead of push. The notion of saying, well, it's 33 then, or it's always arbitrary, and there will always be a date at which somebody says, you've destroyed my life because I'm not any longer in this ward where I'll be able to get married. Well, let's make connections that are happening in the conventional wards, that are happening at multi-stake levels, at the stake level, and then have this. It probably will have to be an arbitrary age at some point.
President Beck.
We should hear a mother's point of view.
2 or 3 thoughts as this discussion is going on. The first one is, why do you have a ward? And I think it's the same purpose for every member of the church. We need a place to go renew our covenants and certify our worthiness and serve and build the kingdom. When we think internationally, most of the discussion that takes place talks about Utah, really. And most of what I see is international church, and a single adult ward is devastating out there, because these people are the lifeblood of the wards and the branches. They hold up the primaries and the relief societies. They run the auxiliaries and the quorums and take care of the young men. And if we siphon them off, you just wouldn't have the leadership. They're the energy and the enthusiasm, by and large, in the international church. I love the idea of strengthening a priesthood line and strengthening a relief society president in that. She has to provide that mother role if that girl doesn't have a mother. And there is a lot we have never done or thought of about strengthening a ward to know how to take care of people and minister to people. We also learned in this committee that most marriages don't occur in these wards. So if our goal is marriage and eternal families, it doesn't happen in these wards. They network outside of that. So if they're not getting married with the people in the singles ward, why do we have it? They don't like to date the people in their ward. It messes up their social group. And then we have a couple of good models in the youth organizations that I think would work. One of the things that works with youth is the way stake pulls them together with young men and young women presidency for one or two great things a year, a youth conference or a trek or a service project or something. And they have a built-in committee and system with that. We could fortify that on a stake level with this group in mind and help them worship where they need to worship, keep covenants where they need to keep them, engage them in the Lord's work, and then have a committee that pulls them together to do some other things. Those are some thoughts that have occurred to me in my studies over time.
Finally, our time is up.